"You're embarrassing this family," my wife said in front of everyone. Even my wife's brother sneered, "Deadbeat." Then, as dinner started, my wife's sister's husband arrived in uniform and froze. He saluted me and said, "Sir." My wife's dad's fork clattered to the floor. My wife's sister turned pale. "My name is Marcus Blake, and I'm 38 years old, though some days I feel like I've lived twice that long. For over a decade now, I've been working in what most people would call the shadows, government defense contracts that deal with classified material so sensitive that even thinking about it wrong could land you in federal prison. The kind of technical, complex, life-or-death important stuff that keeps this country running while everyone else sleeps peacefully in their beds, completely oblivious to the threats lurking just beyond their suburban picket fences. But here's the kicker. To my wife Talia, her entire family, and pretty much everyone else in my orbit, I'm just that guy who works from home. You know the type, right? The dude in sweatpants pecking away at a laptop, probably selling insurance or doing data entry for some faceless corporation. Hell, for all they know, I could be running a pyramid scheme or flipping burgers through a food delivery app. The point is, they don't know, and more importantly, they don't care to find out. Every single family gathering feels like I'm watching a movie where I'm not even an extra. I'm just part of the furniture. Her father, Gerald Prescott, is this old-school retired Army colonel who practically breaks into the national anthem every time someone mentions anything remotely military. The guy's got more respect for a crisp uniform than most people have for their own mothers. Then there's her brother Owen, strutting around like he's single-handedly keeping crime off the streets of our sleepy little town as a police lieutenant. Don't even get me started on her sister Carla, who managed to snag herself a Navy officer husband and acts like she personally won World War II by association. And then there's me, the consultant, the guy with no shiny badge to flash, no snappy salute to throw around, no chest full of colorful ribbons to prove my worth. When people ask what I do, which, let's be honest, rarely happens, I give them some vague answer about technical consulting and watch their eyes glaze over faster than a donut shop window. It's easier that way. Safer too. The thing is, I've been the guy quietly keeping this family afloat for years without so much as a thanks, man, or even basic acknowledgement. When Talia's mom needed her roof fixed after that nasty storm last spring, the one that had half the neighborhood looking like a war zone, guess who quietly slipped the contractor an extra $2,000 to bump her to the front of the line? When Owen got himself tangled up in that excessive force lawsuit that could have ended his career and destroyed his pension, who do you think helped connect him with the right lawyer and covered the retainer fee without being asked? I never asked for a parade or a gold watch. Never expected them to throw me a ticker tape parade down Main Street. But Jesus Christ, a simple thank you would have been nice. Maybe just once, Talia could have stepped up and said, "Hey, back off my husband. He's actually pretty solid." But that never happened. Not once in all these years. Instead, the jokes just kept getting louder and more pointed. Owen's favorite move was to clap me on the shoulder just a little too hard and announce to whoever was listening, "Marcus here is our family's mysterious man of leisure. Must be nice working in your pajamas, right, buddy?" Then he'd laugh, that obnoxious cop laugh. You know the one, all teeth and no genuine humor, while everyone else chuckled along like trained seals. Gerald wasn't much better, though he had this way of making his digs sound almost philosophical. "You know, Marcus," he'd say, puffing on one of those expensive cigars he was always waving around. "There's something to be said for a man who finds his calling in service to others. Of course, some of us chose to serve our country a little more visibly." Then he'd gesture toward whatever uniform happened to be in the room, and everyone would nod along like he'd just delivered the Gettysburg Address. But here's what really got under my skin. Talia never once stood up for me. Not when her brother made his little jokes. Not when her father made his passive-aggressive comments about real service. Not when her sister would introduce me to people as Talia's husband who does something with computers, I think. She'd just smile at. The night before Carla's big promotion dinner, Talia cornered me in our bedroom while I was trying to finish up some paperwork that absolutely couldn't wait. She was standing there in that particular way she does when she's about to drop some unpleasant truth bomb on me. Arms crossed, weight shifted to one hip. That look on her face like she's already disappointed in whatever I'm about to say. "Marcus, Please tell me you're planning to wear something respectable tomorrow night, she said, her voice carrying that sharp edge I'd been hearing more and more lately. And I mean actually respectable, not that wrinkled khaki situation you pulled last time. I looked up from my laptop screen, where I was reviewing security protocols for a federal contractor audit that was due first thing Monday morning. The kind of work that keeps people like her family safe while they sleep, though she'd never know that. What's wrong with khakis? I asked, genuinely confused. She let out this exasperated sigh that made me feel about 2 inches tall. Please don't embarrass us tomorrow, she added. And here's the thing that really stung. She was half joking, half deadly serious. Like she genuinely wasn't sure which Marcus was going to show up. The embarrassing one or the slightly less embarrassing one. For a hot minute there, I seriously considered just staying home. I mean, really considered it. I could have easily told her I was coming down with something, or that work was calling with some urgent crisis that needed my immediate attention. Hell, knowing the kind of stuff I actually deal with on a daily basis, that wouldn't even be a lie most of the time. I had that audit report staring me in the face, plus 3 different security assessments that needed my review before the weekend was over. But something in her voice, that mixture of pleading and resignation, it just pushed me over the edge. Not in an angry way, but in a way that made me realize I needed to see this thing through. I needed to understand just how far down this rabbit hole we'd all fallen. How bad had it really gotten? When did I become the family charity case that everyone just tolerated? So I told her I'd be there, wearing something she'd approve of, and I'd do my best not to humiliate the Prescott family name. She seemed relieved, which probably should have been my first red flag right there. We showed up early because Talia's always been one of those people who thinks arriving fashionably late is somehow disrespectful. Personally, I've always figured that if you tell someone dinner's at 7, showing up at 7:15 just means you're not desperately hovering around their kitchen while they're trying to finish cooking. But what do I know? I'm just the guy who works with computers. I carried in this nice gift bag, expensive bottle of wine, and a leather portfolio I thought Carla might actually use in her new position. Nothing flashy, but quality stuff. The kind of gifts you give when you actually put some thought into what the person might want, as opposed to just grabbing something off the clearance rack at the last minute. Owen was posted up near the front door like some kind of unofficial greeter, and the second he saw me walking up, that familiar smirk spread across his face. Well, look who made it out of the house, he said, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. No big important work emergency today, Marcus? I just smiled and nodded, keeping my mouth shut like I always do. See, here's something most people don't understand about the kind of work I actually do. You learn real quick that sometimes the smartest thing you can say is absolutely nothing at all. Let people make their assumptions. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever makes them feel better about themselves. Inside, the house was buzzing with that particular energy you get when military families gather together. Lots of talk about deployments and duty stations, war stories that get a little more heroic with each telling, inside jokes about drill sergeants and commanding officers that I'm obviously not supposed to understand. Gerald was holding court near the fireplace, still in pretty decent shape for a guy pushing 70, telling anyone who'd listen about some medal ceremony he'd attended last month. I found a spot near the back wall where I could see everything without being directly in anyone's line of fire. It's a habit I picked up somewhere along the way. Always know where the exits are. Always position yourself where you can see what's coming. Talia was immediately absorbed into the sister talk with Carla, planning out the evening's timeline and making sure all the important people knew when to expect the guest of honor. Nobody asked what I'd been working on lately. Nobody seemed curious about why I'd been putting in those long hours or what kind of projects keep a guy glued to his computer until 2 in the morning, which was probably for the best, considering that this week alone I'd been reviewing security protocols for 3 different government facilities and identifying potential vulnerabilities in systems that protect more American lives than all their uniforms combined. But they didn't know that, and they didn't want to know. I was just Marcus, the guy who keeps showing up to these things for reasons nobody could quite figure out. The husband who doesn't quite fit, but somehow hasn't gotten the hint to stop coming around. As I stood there watching Gerald gesture dramatically while describing some long-ago battle strategy, I started wondering what the hell I was even doing there. These people had made it crystal clear over the years that my presence was tolerated at best, barely acknowledged at worst. I wasn't part of their club, wasn't speaking their language of ranks and ribbons and rigid military hierarchy. But something kept me planted in that spot against the wall, nursing a beer I didn't particularly want and listening to conversations that didn't include me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to see exactly how deep this whole situation had gotten. Because I had a feeling that tonight was going to be different somehow. I could feel it in the air, the way you can sense a storm coming hours before the first drops of rain hit the ground. What I didn't know was that everything was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. All I knew right then was that I was the odd man out at another family gathering, carrying gifts nobody would remember and wearing clothes that met with Talia's grudging approval. Just another evening of being invisible in plain sight, waiting for it to be socially acceptable to head home and get back to work that actually mattered. If someone had told me that within the next few hours, everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was going to get turned completely upside down, I probably would have laughed in their face. But that's the thing about life. The moments that change everything usually start out feeling exactly like all the moments that don't. Talia's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife through butter, sharp and precise, but kept just quiet enough that she thought only I could hear it. You need to stop sulking over there like some kind of antisocial teenager. You're embarrassing this family. She said it with that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that somehow managed to sound both concerned and disgusted at the same time. Like my very existence was some kind of personal failing on her part that she was constantly having to manage and apologize for. The way she delivered those words, you'd think I was standing there picking my nose or making inappropriate comments about the appetizers, instead of just quietly minding my own business in the corner. But here's what really got under my skin about the whole thing. She said it like it was somehow my fault that they laughed. Like I was the one creating this whole dynamic where I got treated like the family charity case. As if I was out there begging for their ridicule and disrespect, instead of just trying to exist peacefully in the same room as these people without causing any drama. I mean, what exactly was I supposed to do differently? Jump into conversations about military tactics I wasn't supposed to know anything about? Start bragging about classified work I couldn't discuss even if I wanted to? Pretend to be impressed by stories I'd heard 17 times before about Owen's latest traffic stop heroics? The truth is, I'd learned a long time ago that in situations like this, the smartest move is usually to keep your mouth shut and let other people reveal who they really are. It's amazing what you can learn about someone's character when you just stand back and watch how they treat the person they think has no power to push back. Owen must have caught the tail end of our little sidebar conversation, because he chose that exact moment to slide over with that shit-eating grin plastered across his face. Deadbeat, he muttered, just loud enough for the handful of guests standing nearby to hear clearly. Not quite loud enough to seem like he was trying to start something, but definitely loud enough to make sure everyone got the message. I stood perfectly still and took a deep breath, the kind of controlled, measured breath you learn when you've been trained to handle actual threats instead of just playground bullying from grown men who peaked in high school. I said absolutely nothing, which probably disappointed him since he was clearly fishing for some kind of reaction he could use to justify escalating things further. Here's the thing people don't understand about the kind of work I do. You deal with real threats on a regular basis. I'm talking about people who could actually destroy infrastructure, compromise national security, or put thousands of lives at risk with the right combination of skills and motivation. When you've spent your career identifying and neutralizing those kinds of dangers, some small-town cops' sad attempts at intimidation just don't register as worth your energy. But I'll be honest, it still hurt. Not because I respected Owen's opinion or gave a damn what he thought about my career choices, but because this was supposed to be family. These were supposed to be the people who had your back when the rest of the world got rough, not the people leading the charge to tear you down every chance they got. Carla's husband, Commander Tristan Ford, still hadn't made his grand entrance yet, and you could tell everyone was getting antsy waiting for him. The way they talked about this guy, you'd think he was some combination of George Washington and Superman, personally responsible for keeping democracy alive single-handedly. Gerald kept checking his watch and glancing toward the door like he was expecting the second coming to walk through it at any moment. The food was all laid out on the dining room table, fancy stuff that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Carla had clearly gone all out for this thing, with the good china and cloth napkins and enough silverware to perform surgery if the mood struck you. There were printed programs at each place setting outlining the evening's schedule of speeches and toasts, because apparently we couldn't just eat dinner and call it a night like normal human beings. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how I'd ended up in this particular version of hell. When Talia and I first started dating, her family had seemed pretty normal, maybe a little more focused on military stuff than I was used to, but nothing that felt actively hostile. Gerald had been polite, Owen had been tolerable, and Carla had actually seemed to like me well enough. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Maybe it was gradual, or maybe I just hadn't been paying close enough attention in the beginning. Either way, I'd somehow become the family punching bag without quite understanding how it happened or what I could have done differently to prevent it. Talia kept shooting me these looks from across the room, the kind that said, "Please just try to fit in for once in your life," mixed with, "Why can't you be more like literally anyone else?" She was introducing me to people as my husband Marcus, with this apologetic undertone, like she was warning them in advance not to expect too much from the conversation. "This is Marcus," she'd say to whoever was unfortunate enough to be standing nearby when we approached. "He works with computers and technical stuff." Then she'd quickly change the subject to something more interesting, leaving me standing there like a piece of furniture that had somehow learned to walk upright. I told myself to just survive the evening. Just make it through dinner, sit through whatever speeches they had planned, and then I could go home and forget this whole thing ever happened. Maybe catch up on some actual work, the kind that mattered beyond this suffocating bubble of uniforms and egos. The front door opened with that particular kind of authority that only comes from someone who's used to making an entrance. The entire room seemed to shift its attention like iron filings drawn to a magnet, conversations trailing off mid-sentence as everyone turned to see who had finally arrived. Even the background music from Carla's fancy sound system seemed to fade into the background, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Commander Tristan Ford stepped through the doorway, and I had to admit the guy knew how to work a room. He was wearing his dress uniform, the full dog and pony show with all the bells and whistles that make civilian hearts go pitter-patter. Every crease was razor-sharp, every button polished to mirror brightness, every ribbon and metal positioned with mathematical precision. His boots clicked against the hardwood floor with that distinctive military cadence that says, "I'm important and I know it," without having to speak a single word. Gerald practically jumped out of his chair, beaming like a proud father watching his kid graduate from Harvard. Carla rushed over to give her husband the kind of welcome-home kiss you'd expect after a 6-month deployment, even though the guy had probably just driven over from the base 20 minutes away. Owen straightened up and sucked in his gut, trying to look more impressive in his civilian clothes than he had any right to. But here's where things got interesting. Tristan wasn't playing along with the whole grand entrance routine. He was scanning the room with those sharp, calculating eyes that military officers develop after years of having to quickly assess situations and identify potential problems. His smile was polite but distracted, like he was looking for something specific but wasn't quite sure what. Then his gaze landed on me. I watched his expression change in real time, watched the polite social smile fade and get replaced by something I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could. Not the kind of recognition you get when someone remembers meeting you at a barbecue last summer, but the kind that comes with weight behind it. The kind that means something. He stopped walking. Just stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of Carla's living room, with half the family still crowding around trying to get his attention. His posture went from relaxed husband arriving at a dinner party to officer recognizing a superior, so fast it was almost comical. Almost. And then he saluted me. Not some casual, half-hearted wave of the hand that you might throw around at a 4th of July barbecue. This was a crisp, formal, by-the-book military salute that cut through the air like a blade. Sharp enough to slice bread. Formal enough to make every other person in that room suddenly question everything they thought they knew about the social dynamics at play. "Sir," he said, and his voice carried across the room clear as a bell. Not casual. Not joking around. Not the kind of "sir" you use when you're trying to be funny with your buddy. This was the real deal. The kind of respectful acknowledgement that comes from someone who knows exactly who they're talking to and understands the appropriate level of respect that situation demands. Every single fork, knife, and spoon in that room hit china with a collective clatter that sounded like a small avalanche. Gerald's eyes went so wide I was genuinely concerned he might stroke out right there on the spot. Carla turned pale as hospital sheets, her mouth falling open like she was trying to catch flies. Owen just stared, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his lips, looking like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. But it was Talia's reaction that really got to me. She just froze completely, like someone had hit a pause button on her entire existence. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes locked on the space between me and Tristan like she was trying to decode some message written in a language she'd never learned. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 20-plus pairs of eyes tracking my every movement. This was one of those moments where you can feel the entire trajectory of your life shifting beneath your feet, where you know that whatever happens next is going to change everything that comes after it. I returned the salute, clean and professional, the way I'd been taught years ago in training that most of these people didn't know I'd ever received. "At ease, Commander," I said quietly, but in a room that had gone dead silent. It might as well have been shouted through a megaphone. The air felt electric, like the moment right before lightning strikes. You could practically hear people's brains grinding as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't some elaborate joke or coincidence. This was real recognition between two people who understood protocols and hierarchies that the rest of the room had no context for. Nobody could explain what had just happened, but they all knew they'd witnessed something significant. The family dynamic that had been carved in stone for years had just been dynamited into rubble, and everyone was still trying to figure out where they fit in this new landscape. But I could explain it, even if I wasn't about to. Tristan had seen my name before, probably in a security briefing or on a classified document somewhere along the way. He knew that I wasn't just Talia's husband who works with computers. He understood that I was someone whose work had real weight behind it, someone whose contributions actually mattered in ways that went far beyond small-town dinner party politics. For the first time in years, someone in that room saw me for who I actually was instead of who they'd decided I must be. And that recognition changed everything. Tristan moved through the crowd like it was the Red Sea parting, and let me tell you, nobody was about to get in this guy's way. He walked straight over to where I was standing and took the seat right beside me at the dinner table, completely ignoring the carefully planned seating arrangement that Carla had probably spent hours perfecting. The chair he chose had been meant for Owen, but somehow I didn't think anyone was going to have the balls to point that out right now. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring. We're talking about a solid minute of absolutely nothing. No conversation, no clinking silverware, no background music, just the sound of 20 people trying to breathe quietly while their brains worked overtime trying to process what the hell they'd just witnessed. It was the kind of silence that happens right before something big explodes, when everyone knows the world is about to change, but nobody's quite sure how. Then the whispers started, and let me tell you, it was like listening to a bunch of middle schoolers trying to figure out who was dating who. Except these were supposedly grown adults who'd been treating me like background noise for the better part of a decade. Why did he salute Marcus? I heard someone mutter from across the table. Did he really say sir? Came from somewhere near the kitchen. What the hell is going on here? Floated over from the direction of the living room. The questions were flying around the room faster than rumors at a high school reunion, and every single one of them was centered on me. For once in my adult life, I was the most interesting person at a Prescott family gathering, and honestly, I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Talia looked like she'd just swallowed a handful of ice cubes. She kept glancing between me and Tristan like she was watching some tennis match where she didn't understand the rules but could tell the score was important. Her face had gone through about 6 different shades of confusion, and she was gripping her wine glass so tight I was genuinely worried she might shatter it. Gerald had completely stopped eating, which for anyone who knew the man was basically the equivalent of the sun rising in the west. His fork was suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth, loaded with some fancy roast beef that was probably getting cold while he stared at me like I'd just grown a second head. Every few seconds he'd start to say something, then apparently think better of it and close his mouth again. Owen had managed to spill half his beer trying to look casual, and now there was a spreading wet spot on Carla's expensive tablecloth that nobody was acknowledging. He kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air, probably running through his mental catalog of smart-ass comments, and coming up empty for once in his miserable life. Carla herself was alternating between glancing nervously at her husband and shooting these weird looks in my direction, like she was seeing me for the first time and wasn't sure she liked what she was discovering. She'd gone pale enough that her makeup was starting to look a little dramatic against her skin, and she kept fidgeting with her napkin like it held the answers to all of life's mysteries. Through all of this chaos, I just stayed calm, ate my dinner slowly and methodically, the way I'd been trained to do in situations where maintaining composure was the difference between success and complete disaster. I didn't feel the need to explain anything or justify what had just happened. I didn't owe these people an explanation for who I was or what I did with my life. The truth had already spoken louder than any words I could have used. After dinner, while everyone else was still stumbling around like they'd been hit with a mental flashbang grenade, Tristan quietly approached me near the back patio. We stepped outside where the conversation couldn't be overheard, and he looked me straight in the eye with the kind of respect I hadn't seen from anyone in this family circle since, well, ever. "They don't know, do they?" he asked, and there was something almost sad in his voice. Like he genuinely couldn't believe that a man's own family could be so completely clueless about what he actually contributed to the world. I shook my head. "They don't need to," I replied, because that was the truth. My work wasn't about recognition or appreciation from people who wouldn't understand it anyway. It was about results, about keeping people safe, about solving problems that most folks never even knew existed. He nodded slowly, respectfully, like he understood exactly what I meant. "They should," he said simply, and there was weight behind those two words that hit me harder than I expected. Here was a guy who'd probably seen classified briefings with my name on them, who understood the kind of work that happens in the shadows to keep the lights on and the bad guys at bay. He knew that while Gerald was telling war stories from 30 years ago and Owen was writing traffic tickets for expired registration tags, I was dealing with threats that could affect thousands of lives. But more than that, he understood why I didn't need to advertise it. Real professionals don't need to wave their credentials around at dinner parties. The work speaks for itself to the people who matter, and everyone else can think whatever they want to think. As we walked back inside, I could feel the entire dynamic of the evening had shifted permanently. These people who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenience were suddenly looking at me with something that might have been respect, or at least confusion mixed with a healthy dose of curiosity. The thing is, I didn't need their validation to know my worth. But I'll admit, it felt pretty damn good to watch them finally realize they'd been wrong about me all along. 3 days after what I'd started thinking of as the salute heard round the dinner table, Talia finally worked up the nerve to ask me the question that had obviously been eating her alive since we left Carla's house. We were sitting in our kitchen on a Wednesday morning, her nursing her second cup of coffee while I reviewed some technical specifications that needed my attention before noon. "What exactly do you do, Marcus?" she asked, and the way she said it, like she was asking about some dark family secret I'd been hiding in the basement, told me everything I needed to know about how the last few days had been treating her. I couldn't help myself. I actually laughed out loud, which probably wasn't the reaction she was expecting. "Now you're curious?" I asked, setting down my laptop and really looking at her for the first time in what felt like months. After 12 years of marriage, after 1,000 family dinners where nobody bothered to ask, "Now you want to know what I do for a living?" She didn't like that response one bit. Her jaw tightened up in that way it does when she's trying to decide whether to escalate into a full argument or just let something slide. "It's not funny, Marcus. Tristan saluted you. Like, actually saluted you. Dad hasn't stopped talking about it since we left. He's been calling his old army buddies trying to figure out what the hell happened in his daughter's dining room." I just shrugged, taking a sip of my own coffee and watching her face cycle through about 6 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. "Tristan knows my work," I said simply. "That's all there is to it." And that was all I was going to say about it, at least right then. See, here's the thing about security clearances and classified work. You don't just get to spill your guts because your wife suddenly developed an interest in your career. There are protocols, procedures, and about 1,000 different ways you can accidentally cross lines that will land you in federal prison faster than you can say need-to-know basis. But more than that, I was genuinely curious to see how this was all going to play out. For over a decade, these people had made their assumptions about who I was and what I was worth based on absolutely nothing. They'd created this whole narrative in their heads where I was some kind of deadbeat loser who'd somehow tricked their precious Talia into marrying me, and they'd been perfectly content to treat me like garbage based on that story they'd told themselves. Now that narrative was crumbling, and I wanted to see what they'd build to replace it. Gerald called the house 2 days later, something he'd never done in all the years I'd known him. Not once. Hell, I wasn't even sure the man had our phone number memorized before this week. When I saw his name pop up on the caller ID, I just let it go to voicemail. I was in the middle of reviewing security protocols for a new government facility anyway, and Gerald Prescott's sudden interest in my existence could wait. His message was about what you'd expect from a career military man who'd just realized he might have seriously misjudged a situation. "Marcus, this is Gerald. I think I may have. Well, I think I misjudged you, son. Would appreciate a word when you get a chance. Just to, clear the air between us." I never called him back. Not because I was holding some grudge or trying to punish the guy, but because what would have been the point? Gerald's opinion of me had been irrelevant for years, and one awkward phone conversation wasn't going to change the fundamental dynamic between us. Either he'd figure out how to treat me with basic human respect going forward, or he wouldn't. His choice. Carla surprised me by actually reaching out via text message about a week later. Her approach was different, more direct, less focused on trying to preserve her father's ego. "Tristan told me a little about what you actually do," she wrote. "I had no idea. I'm sorry for how we've treated you. That wasn't right. That one I appreciated. Not because I needed her apology to feel better about myself, but because it showed she was capable of growth. It takes guts to admit you've been wrong about someone, especially when that someone is family and you've been wrong for years. Most people would rather just pretend the whole thing never happened and hope everyone forgets about it eventually." Owen, predictably, never said a damn word. He just stopped making his little jokes and comments, at least when I was around to hear them. I'd catch him staring sometimes at family gatherings after that, like he was trying to solve some puzzle he'd never noticed before. But direct acknowledgement that maybe he'd been a complete ass? That was apparently beyond his capabilities. The guy kept posting his usual social media nonsense. Gym selfies with captions about earning respect through dedication and duty before ego, and all that motivational poster bullshit that sounds deep until you realize it's coming from someone who peaked in high school and never quite figured out how to be an adult. Honestly, Owen's silence said more about his character than any apology could have. When confronted with evidence that he'd been completely wrong about someone, his response was just to pretend it never happened and hope nobody noticed. Classic move from someone who's never learned how to handle being wrong about anything important. But here's what really struck me about the whole situation: how quickly everyone's behavior changed once they realized they might have been missing something. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore at family gatherings. People actually asked me questions, looked me in the eye when they talked to me, seemed genuinely interested in my responses. It was fascinating and depressing at the same time. Work picked up significantly in the weeks following what I'd started thinking of as the Great Revelation. It was like the universe had decided to remind me why I'd gotten into this line of work in the first place, before I'd allowed myself to get bogged down in the petty family drama that had been consuming way too much of my mental energy. A new client out in Arizona needed a complete security overhaul for their data infrastructure, the kind of project that required someone who could think like both a defender and an attacker, someone who understood that the real threats weren't always the obvious ones. Then there was a quiet conference in Washington, D.C. that I'd been invited to present at, the kind where nobody takes photos and the attendee list never gets published anywhere public. These were the moments that reminded me who I actually was when I wasn't playing the role of Talia's mysteriously unemployed husband at family dinners. Out here in the real world, dealing with actual professionals who understood the stakes involved in keeping critical systems secure, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't background noise. I was the guy people called when they needed problems solved that could affect thousands of lives if handled incorrectly. The Arizona project led me to work with a sharp young guy named Jonas, fresh out of graduate school, with a computer science degree and enough natural curiosity to be genuinely dangerous if pointed in the right direction. Kid reminded me of myself about 15 years ago, back when I still thought the most important part of any job was getting credit for being the smartest person in the room. Jonas had that hunger you see in people who figured out they're good at something but haven't yet learned the difference between being smart and being wise. He'd ask questions that cut straight to the heart of complex security protocols, then get frustrated when the answers weren't as clean and definitive as he wanted them to be. Why do we spend so much time on threats that might never happen? He asked me one afternoon while we were reviewing penetration test results for a government contractor's network. Statistically speaking, most of these attack vectors have never been exploited in the wild. I looked up from my laptop and really studied his face for a moment. Here was someone who understood the technical side of what we did, but hadn't yet grasped the philosophical weight of it. Because the moment we stop preparing for the threats that haven't happened yet is the moment they start happening, I told him. Our job isn't to protect against yesterday's attacks. It's to think 3 steps ahead of people who are actively trying to hurt innocent folks. Over the next few months, I ended up mentoring Jonas and a couple other new hires who joined our little team. It felt good to be building something real, working with people who trusted my judgment without needing to see my resume framed on the wall or hear war stories about my greatest professional hits. These were people who measured success by results rather than recognition, who understood that the best security work happens in the shadows where nobody notices it until something goes wrong. We'd spend weeks identifying vulnerabilities in critical systems, then quietly patch them without fanfare or applause. No medals, no ceremonies, no photo ops with politicians trying to look tough on national security. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere out there, people were safer because of work they'd never hear about, done by people whose names they'd never know. One day, Jonas asked me something that caught me off guard. We were wrapping up a training session on social engineering attacks, and he was packing up his gear with that thoughtful expression he got when something was really bothering him. "Do you ever feel invisible?" he asked, not making eye contact. "Like, you do all this work that matters, but nobody outside this little bubble knows or cares what you actually contribute." The question hit me harder than I expected, probably because it was exactly what I'd been dealing with in my personal life for years. Here was this kid, brilliant and dedicated already starting to realize that the most important work often goes completely unrecognized by the people who benefit from it most. Only to people who need loudness to see value. I replied, and I meant every word of it. The work speaks for itself to the people who matter. Everyone else can think whatever they want to think. I watched something shift in his expression, like he was filing that advice away for future reference. It reminded me of a conversation I'd had with my own mentor years ago, back when I was still figuring out whether I wanted recognition more than I wanted results. The truth is, building that small team of people who actually understood what we were doing felt more fulfilling than any family dinner ever had. These were relationships based on mutual respect and shared purpose, not just biological coincidence and social obligation. When Jonas or one of the others came to me with a complex problem, they genuinely wanted my input because they trusted my expertise, not because they felt sorry for me or were trying to be polite. It was the difference between being valued for who you actually are versus being tolerated for who people think you should be. And once you experience that kind of authentic professional respect, it becomes pretty hard to get excited about performing for people who've already decided you're not worth their attention. Every week, I trained my team to spot flaws in systems before lives were lost, to think like attackers so they could defend more effectively, to understand that their work mattered even when nobody was paying attention. It was the kind of meaningful impact that made all the family drama feel pretty insignificant by comparison. Carla called me on a Tuesday evening in late September, catching me right in the middle of reviewing security protocols for a financial institution that handled retirement accounts for about half the federal workforce. I almost didn't answer. After years of family calls that usually meant someone needed money or wanted me to fix their computer problems for free, I developed a pretty healthy skepticism about unexpected phone conversations with the Prescott clan. But something made me pick up on the third ring. Maybe just curiosity about what fresh drama might be brewing in the family dynamics department. "Marcus? It's Carla. Do you have a minute?" Her voice sounded different than usual. Less of that casual superiority I'd gotten used to over the years. More like someone who was genuinely uncertain about how the conversation was going to go. "Sure, what's up?" I replied, saving my work and leaning back in my chair. Through the window, I could see the neighbors' dog chasing squirrels around their backyard with the kind of determined enthusiasm that reminded me of Owen pursuing his latest fitness trend. "I just want to say thank you," she said. And those 6 words hit me like a punch to the gut because they were so completely unexpected. Nobody in this family had thanked me for anything in longer than I could remember, let alone called specifically to express gratitude for something I couldn't even identify. Thank you for what? I asked, genuinely confused about where this was heading. My first thought was that maybe Talia had told her about some favor I'd done recently, though I couldn't think of anything that would warrant a special phone call. Carla took a deep breath, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. Tristan told me more than he was probably supposed to, she admitted. About your work, about what you actually do. He mentioned that you helped design the counter-infiltration training protocol he went through last year, the one that probably saved his unit from walking into an ambush during that deployment in Eastern Europe. I didn't reply right away, partly because I was trying to figure out how much Tristan had actually shared with her, and partly because I was genuinely surprised that she was bringing this up at all. The project she was referring to had been one of those quiet successes that never make the news, a new training system that helped military units identify and avoid sophisticated trap scenarios designed by hostile actors. It was good work, important work, but it wasn't the kind of thing you typically got family phone calls about 6 months after the fact. That's not really something I can discuss in detail, I finally said, which was the truth. Even if Tristan had shared some information with his wife, there were still protocols about what could and couldn't be talked about over unsecured phone lines. I know, and I'm not asking for details, Carla said quickly. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. About what you do, about why you can't talk about it, about how wrong we've all been about you for so long. The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated misunderstandings and missed opportunities for basic human decency. I found myself thinking about all the family gatherings where I'd been treated like furniture, all the jokes about my supposed lack of ambition, all the times I'd bitten my tongue, while people who didn't know jack shit about my actual contributions made assumptions about my worth as a human being. I appreciate you saying that, I finally replied, because it was true even if it didn't change the fundamental dynamic of our relationship. That means something, even if it doesn't fix everything that's happened before now. For what it's worth, you made me think, she added, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that I'd never heard before. About how we judge people, about what we assume when we don't have all the information. Tristan says you're one of the most respected professionals he's ever encountered, and he's worked with some pretty impressive people over the years. That was enough for me. Not because I needed validation from Carla or her husband, but because it represented something I hadn't expected to see from anyone in this family. Actual growth, genuine reflection about past behavior, and the intellectual honesty to admit when you've been wrong about something important. The apology itself wasn't what mattered most to me. Plenty of people can say, "I'm sorry," when they get caught being assholes. What mattered was the shift in perspective, the recognition that maybe their little bubble of military hierarchy and social positioning wasn't the only valid way to measure someone's worth. "How are things with Talia?" Carla asked, and I could tell she was genuinely concerned rather than just fishing for gossip to share with the rest of the family. "Complicated," I said honestly. "We're figuring some things out." She didn't push for details, which I appreciated. Instead, she just said, "Well, for what it's worth, I hope you both find what you're looking for. And Marcus? Thanks for taking my call. I wasn't sure you would." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a while thinking about how strange it felt to be seen clearly by someone who'd spent years looking right through me. It was too little, too late to change the fundamental trajectory of my relationships with this family, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, some people were capable of growth even when it required admitting they'd been wrong about something important. Talia and I drifted apart like 2 pieces of debris floating away from each other after a shipwreck. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, no screaming matches, no thrown dishes, no tearful confrontations in the middle of the night. It was more like watching something slowly dissolve, the way sugar disappears into coffee until you can't even tell it was ever there in the first place. The space between what I needed from a relationship and what she was capable of providing had been growing for years, but somehow we'd both managed to pretend it wasn't happening. Like if we just ignored the fundamental incompatibility long enough, maybe it would magically fix itself through sheer force of wishful thinking. But after the whole salute incident and everything that followed, that space became impossible to ignore. I needed to be with someone who saw me for who I actually was, not who they thought I should be. Someone who respected my work even if they couldn't understand all the details. Someone who would stand up for me when other people decided to take shots, instead of joining in or just staying silent while it happened. Talia needed someone who fit neatly into her family's social structure. Someone whose achievements she could brag about at dinner parties. Someone who made sense within the narrow little world she'd grown up in. And that person just wasn't me, no matter how hard we both tried to pretend otherwise. We separated on a cold February morning, sitting at our kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee that neither of us was drinking. The conversation was quiet, almost businesslike in its civility. No drama, no accusations, no attempts to assign blame for how we'd gotten to this point. "This isn't working anymore, is it?" she said, and there was relief in her voice along with the sadness. Like she'd been waiting for one of us to say it out loud so we could stop pretending everything was fine. "No, it's not," I agreed. "Hasn't been for a while now." She didn't ask me to explain why, and I didn't ask her to justify her feelings. We both knew what the problems were, and talking them to death wasn't going to solve anything. Sometimes relationships just run their course, and the healthiest thing you can do is acknowledge that fact instead of trying to force something that's already broken. The legal stuff was straightforward enough. No kids, no major shared assets beyond the house. No bitter fights over who got what. We split things fairly and moved on with our lives like adults, which apparently surprised the hell out of her family. I think they were expecting some kind of messy divorce drama they could gossip about for months. I bought a small place out west, nothing fancy but perfect for my needs. 3 bedrooms, one of which I converted into a proper office where I could work without distractions. A decent kitchen for the nights when I felt like cooking instead of ordering takeout. A front porch where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the sunrise without hearing traffic or neighbors arguing about property lines. Setting up my own advisory firm was easier than I'd expected. Turns out that when you've spent over a decade building a reputation for solid, reliable work in a specialized field, clients don't care whether you're operating out of a fancy corporate office or your spare bedroom. They care about results, about finding someone who can solve their problems without making them worse in the process. My client base was small but steady. Government contractors who needed security audits, private companies dealing with sensitive data, the occasional federal agency that required outside consultation on projects they couldn't handle internally. Quiet work with high stakes. Exactly the kind of challenges I'd always been drawn to. The best part was the respect factor. These people hired me because they knew what I could do, not because they felt sorry for me or were trying to help out a family member. When I made recommendations, they listened. When I identified problems, they took action. When I explained why certain security measures were necessary, they implemented them without arguing about the cost or convenience. It was amazing how much lighter I felt once I stopped trying to constantly prove my worth to people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their attention. My parents came to visit once that first spring, and we spent the afternoon sitting on the porch talking about everything and nothing. "You seem different," my mom said, watching me refill her iced tea glass. "More relaxed, I guess. More like yourself." She was right. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe properly. I wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't constantly monitoring my words to avoid giving someone ammunition for their next round of jokes, wasn't trying to shrink myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for me in the first place. I finally stopped auditioning. I told her, and she nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. Because sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is stop trying to earn approval from people who are never going to give it anyway. I never went back to another Prescott family dinner, and honestly, nobody seemed particularly surprised by that decision. After the divorce was finalized and the dust settled, it became pretty clear that my connection to that whole circus had been through marriage rather than any genuine family bond. Without Talia as the bridge between their world and mine, there wasn't really anything left to maintain. Gerald never called again after that one awkward voicemail I'd ignored. I heard through the grapevine that he'd spent a few weeks trying to figure out exactly what kind of work I did, reaching out to old military contacts and asking vague questions about government contractors and security clearances. But whatever he discovered, he kept to himself. Maybe he finally understood that some things are better left alone, or maybe he just realized that his opinion of me had never mattered as much as he thought it did. Owen kept doing his thing on social media, posting gym selfies with motivational captions about earning respect through dedication and separating the real warriors from the wannabes. The irony was completely lost on him, of course. Here was a guy who'd spent years disrespecting someone whose actual contributions to national security made his traffic stops and DUI arrests look like community theater. But self-awareness had never been Owen's strong suit, so I wasn't exactly holding my breath waiting for him to develop some. Carla was different, though. She kept in touch through occasional text messages and emails, usually around holidays or when something reminded her of our conversation that night. Nothing heavy or dramatic. Just the kind of casual contact you maintain with someone you respect, even if you don't see them regularly. It was more than I'd expected and exactly what I needed. Acknowledgement without obligation, connection without drama. About 6 months after I'd settled into my new place, a package showed up at my door with no return address. Inside was a book on leadership and unspoken service, the kind of thoughtful analysis of how real influence works behind the scenes. Tucked inside the front cover was a short note written in neat, precise handwriting. To the man whose silence taught me the most. T.F. Tristan Ford. The guy who'd changed everything with one simple salute, who'd recognized what nobody else in that room had been willing to see. I never responded to the note because it didn't require a response. It was a statement of fact rather than a request for acknowledgement. But the book sits on my office shelf now, and every time I see it, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important recognition comes from people who understand the weight of real responsibility. These days, I spend my time building real systems and training real people. My little advisory firm has grown into something I'm genuinely proud of, not because it's flashy or impressive on paper, but because it makes a difference in ways that matter. Jonas runs point on most of the technical assessments now, and he's developed into exactly the kind of professional I'd hoped he could become when I first started mentoring him. We've got a small team of specialists who share the same philosophy I've always believed in. Do the work right, protect the people who need protecting, and don't worry about who gets credit for the results. It's the kind of environment where competence matters more than personality, where results speak louder than rhetoric, where nobody has to prove their worth through anything other than the quality of their contributions. I speak softly these days, but I no longer shrink myself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me. When clients ask for my recommendations, I give them clearly and directly. When team members need guidance, I provide it without sugarcoating the hard truths they need to hear. When problems arise that require expertise, I step up and handle them without waiting for permission or validation from anyone else. The difference is that now I'm operating in a world where my voice actually carries weight, where people listen because they respect what I bring to the table rather than because they feel obligated to pretend they care. It's amazing how much more effective you can be when you stop wasting energy trying to convince people who are never going to see your value anyway. Because sometimes, the sharpest salute is the one given in recognition of work that was never meant to be seen. Sometimes the loudest justice is the kind that doesn't need to be explained to people who wouldn't understand it anyway. And sometimes the most meaningful legacy you can build is the one that protects people who will never know your name, but are safer because you existed. I chose to build something real instead of performing for an audience that was never really watching. And that choice made all the difference.